One of the things that the AP program for US history says we have to cover is the sort of the decision in the United States as to how to address communism, especially the threat or the possibility of communism at home in the United States. So the famous element of this is McCarthyism and the witch hunts. So the lesson is going to be about that, and then a broader, sort of more modern connection, the idea of sticking up for people who are falsely accused. Specifically to understand the idea of McCarthyism, to understand the pushback against McCarthy, the inclusion that came from that. In a broader sense, it helps them understand the seriousness of the Cold War and how big of an effect the fear had on Americans at the time. Bigger than that is sort of they need to understand the outcomes of World War II, set up a new dynamic, and then we're going to be doing the following week. We're going to be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is sort of the climax of the Cold War. So they need to understand the seriousness of that and how threatened people felt, so they can understand how important the Cuban Missile Crisis was and why it was such a crisis. So in a way, it's an outcome of our study of World War II, but then it also builds up towards what's coming later on. I will do things later on to go back and review and to that sort of check for understanding. But with this particular class, they're almost all seniors. They're some of the top kids in school. I really drive for a couple of weeks, and then I'll go back and do a pause and go back and check and make sure there's some understanding. Now, I know that that's probably not the best way to do it. I should probably be checking more as we go. But in this particular case, the activities I think are so worthwhile in class that I dedicate the class time to the activity rather than doing like the little checking as you go kind of activities.
Will you be doing little formative checks maybe?
I'll be watching and I'll be asking them questions to see what sort of things they're talking about. And I ask them questions to try and elicit things that they've read about or that they did for their homework. So usually in the activity that we're doing, at least one person, no one will take them in their group, and so they'll get blacklisted. And so I'll ask, what was the name for this? Do you know what it was? Or can you think of somebody who was in that position? And so they'll start calling out stuff. But it's not like, everyone take out a little half sheet of paper and let's do a mini quiz. I'm not going to do that with this class. My 10th grade class, yes, every day, not this particular group of students. Activity sets up with, it's based on a PowerPoint that goes through the rules. So it emphasizes the rules a couple times, the procedures. This class, I've never really had any behavior issues with this group. It's just not that group of kids. But I do lay out the expectations of how the activity is going to go, and there's sort of a time set for it. So I think sort of the laying out the ground rules usually helps with any particular class. And it's no different here. They know what the expectations are. They know what they're going to do. They have a goal in mind. I give extra credit for the winning teams, so they're motivated in that way. Behavior-wise, it's not an issue. Every once in a while, if it's going too much, I'll blink the lights to get their attention. I don't like to yell too much, although sometimes I forget and I do that anyway. But generally, I'm not worried about having a problem with this class. Okay, so at the end of the first activity, there's going to be a series of questions as to, like, how did you decide who was going to be in your group? How did you decide who to suspect? Why would you choose to accuse somebody? What did it feel like to be accused? Trying to put them into the mindset of the people who lived through the late 40s, early 50s, through that sort of a few years where McCarthy was really strong in his accusations. To understand a little bit why people would actually go out and do the things that they did. So that'll be an element there. Later on, it's going to be more of a review back to what we've done previously, like the difference between capitalism and communism, why Americans believe so strongly that capitalism was better, but also to drive home the point that the whole Cold War was a fight between ideas rather than a fight over territory or like a religious fight or something like that. It was really a fight between ideas about the best way to run a country. Engaging in a sense like they're active, they're involved, they're going to be making a lot of choices about it. Then there's the pause and reflect back, so they're going to connect some of the historical stuff to it. When we do the poem, I draw cards I have kids read. I stop periodically, I draw more cards and ask them questions. So I use the cards in class. I think that's a really important tool because then they can't check out. You know, they always know at any moment I might get called on, and they don't want to look dumb in front of their friends, so they pay attention. So I know like people do popsicle sticks or whatever the trick is, but it's a great trick. Generally keeps most people engaged. I've never had a kid fall asleep during his lesson for all the years that I've done it, so I'm not worried about that. I think you can look at it from two ways. It's investment emotionally for them because as 17-year-olds, they're fairly interested in belongingness, you know, in having friends and being part of a group. And the activity is interesting because when they have to form groups, and most of the kids have a little card that says green, and some will have a red card, and they want to be with only greens, but they can't show the card to anyone else. And so the first thing they'll do is they'll all go get with their friends because they naturally trust each other. And then they'll start to mistrust each other. And if they don't, I go around and start planting some thoughts in their head to make sure that the activity works. But suddenly, like the regular social order starts to fall apart. And it's really interesting to watch them suddenly become very suspicious of each other. And all of those feelings of like, my friends don't like me, or I better hurry up and accuse somebody else because my friends will suspect me otherwise. Like we become very, I'm trying to think of the name of the book right now, where the kids get stuck on the island, Lord of the Flies. They become very Lord of the Flies. It's exactly what happens. They become very tribal and territorial and please love me and take me in your group. And they have a strong emotional investment just because it's a human thing that comes out of it. So then afterwards when we discuss it, they can understand the feelings of people back then because they just experienced those feelings. For me, it's an emotional investment. The lesson is really important to me because you know, the kids in this particular class are going to become community leaders someday. They're going to be business owners, and they're going to be, you know, just by nature of who they are as these AP students, they're going to be leaders someday. And I really feel scared that someday in the future we may have leaders out there who are not able to recognize the demagogues and, you know, the McCarthy type people. So I have a strong interest in having the lesson be a success in that way. There's a few lessons that I do during the year that I tend to get emotional, and this sometimes is one of those. Depends on how it goes. So they're going to do a reading ahead of time, their homework beforehand, which is about McCarthy, and they have to study who he was and what he did, and HUAC and the witch hunts and the Hollywood 10. And so they'll get some background knowledge of it. And then another reading, they're going to do the sort of the historical side. And then the other part of it is they're going to be studying, like they're going to look at the kind of rhetoric that Trump and Cruz are putting out right now. And we've talked a lot about Trump in class because it's kind of an exciting character to discuss. But sort of the idea of blanket blaming other people for your problems or accusing without any evidence, and sort of I'm sort of openly liberal in my discussions at class. I tell them that. But to understand a little more in depth why, not just that I think he sounds ridiculous, but why it is that he makes me scared, and connecting that to the historical past. Because you know, we're repeating in a way McCarthyism from the past is coming back in sort of a modified form here. I want them to understand what that's like and you know, why it's scary, and to know that we've seen this before. This is not a brand new phenomenon. So in that way it's relevant. We're going to bring in, at the end of there's an interactive activity. Then afterwards there's going to be a poem. So the kids who are into the language and so on, there's going to be a poem in there, the literature type students. We're going to have a video afterwards, historical video from the time period. So the kids who are into that. I'm going to try and bring in some different elements to it, sort of drive home the point in the end.